All right, so let's dive into part two. We just talked about at the end of part one how it's important to understand that the PBIS framework and approach to expectations is about teaching and not assuming that students understand those expectations. And so let's take a minute to just reflect about PBIS and SEL right here, because this is super important when we talk about teaching social skills. And we know that the school-wide matrix can be used to teach those critical SEL skills based on those 5 competencies. So this is something we talk about all the time as a team. So I want to take a second to just pause here as we talk about the teaching of these skills and reflect with a recent ASCD article. And this article is linked right below this video in Schoology. So you'll see the link to this article, but I have also linked it in the slides. And so Dina Simmons, the Assistant Director at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, shares a question as it relates to the teaching of these skills. She asks, why teach relationship skills if the lessons do not reflect on the interpersonal conflicts that result from racism? Why discuss self and social awareness without considering power and privilege, even if that means examining controversial topics like white supremacy? And so this is important when talking about SEL that is responsive to the needs of our students. And the title of the ASCD article is Why We Can't Afford Whitewashed Social Emotional Learning. And this is an important topic, especially in her role that she brings up at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So the question here in our 7th discussion thread will be for staff to engage in these conversations with students they will need. So let's all just think about how we would finish that prompt. This is a hefty piece we're talking about here when we discuss how to authentically talk about social emotional learning with our students. And so how would we finish that sentence? Okay, so we're going to look at the next component of the 5 core components, and this is situational appropriateness. Okay, so when we look at situational appropriateness, it's the ability to determine what types of behavior will ensure positive outcomes in a given setting. It also includes altering one's behavior when settings or contexts or companions change, right? And so staff who seek to validate and affirm students will then refrain from making assumptions about student behavior and instead will seek to understand that behavior. So we talk about that quite often, right? So this will require conscious attention to those dynamics of cultural difference between staff, students, and the environment. And staff have to have an understanding of their own values, as we talked about before, and how those values influence their expectations and interpretations of student behavior. So this involves a little bit of that implicit bias, right? Staff also take the time to learn about their students' cultural identities and validate and affirm cultural differences. And then when they see that cultural differences are then discovered, staff explicitly teach to fluency the expectations in the academic setting and why those expectations are critical to success, right? And so in the video that Kent McIntosh shares, he talks about this particular activity here. He talks about the personal matrix activity, and he talks about, we know this activity in a sense, right? Because we have our matrices and we have our home matrix that we've talked about, and many of our schools have used this on parent nights and offered it to parents and asked parents to complete it with their kids at home. But he uses this activity in a different way. He talks about having students to complete this personal matrix, but then using this personal matrix to then ask some critical questions to inform the actual school-wide matrix. And some of those questions that he asks are, what are there differences between what it looks like at home or in the neighborhood and what it looks like at school? And then he asks, are the different school rules necessary for positive student development? And then he asks another question, what additional practice or teaching or acknowledgement may be then needed? So these are very important questions and a very different type of activity that he speaks about that actually ends up informing the school-wide matrix. And so in our next discussion, let's think about, in creating a school-wide matrix that reflects positive student development as well as our students' cultures, how valuable might this activity be, particularly for our high schools? to engage in with their PBIS student leaders. So let's just think about it in that context. Feel free to share any other thoughts you have, but how valuable might this activity be for those high school PBIS student leaders? Okay, let's look at that last core component, which is data for equity. And so this component speaks to the fact that culturally responsive systems are based on an understanding that it's important to disaggregate data for analysis and action planning, right? To discuss those trends. We know this is a core piece of our TIPS process and what we train our teams in. And as teams gain those skills in analyzing the data, we see some of that disproportion revealed in that data, right? And we acknowledge that the American education system was designed by that dominant ethnicity, so it's easy to assume that our systems are working if our dominant groups are responding positively. But disaggregating data requires that teams look at all the enrolled groups, right, to determine if our way of work, right, is adversely affecting some of those subgroups. We talk about this as well. Who are those subgroups? How are subgroups doing in school academically and behaviorally? And then it's critical to address those issues of disparate impact at the systems level. And one of those ways might be operationally defining those subject behaviors, right? Such as defiance, the 3Ds, thinking about how we classify them as classroom versus office. What are those strategies we have in place? How might implicit bias affect our perceptions, right? As opposed to placing blame just on the students or families, believing that those kids, for example, are disrespectful and don't value education. In our next discussion, let's think, how many of your PBIS teams discussed disproportionate rates of referrals for subgroups this year, for just this school year? And then if so, what did they believe their next step should be in light of the data? So this is a great question for us to ask, to reflect on our work last year and how these conversations went among our teams, and then what next steps might they have had, or might they have not developed any next steps because they didn't know what to do. So let's just reflect here and share with each other about what we've noticed our teams doing in their work. Okay, so now we're going to dive into this next piece, right? So this is where we're going to pull in all of those 15 TFI features, and we're going to align them with these 5 core components of cultural responsiveness. And you'll notice I'm going to move in order through each of these 5 core components, but the TFI features that are aligned with each of these might be out of order, right? So we're not going to go in order from 1 to 15, but we are going to align them as we go through each of these 5 core components. Okay, and so this is revealed in the TFI, the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, I should say. They've aligned all of them, so this is evident if you look in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. I've just presented it in a way that's easy for us to reflect around. So let's look at the first core component of identity. They align one particular TFI feature to identity, which is 1.7 professional development. We know that the big idea around this is just those formal processes for providing training, right, and practice to our staff to increase fidelity of PBIS. But they elaborate in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide to talk about professional development, focusing on not only implementation of the PBIS framework, but the cultural responsiveness core components, right, those 5 core components, being explicit about what those components are, letting staff know what those components are, and then making sure that historic context and present-day issues specific to the school's underserved populations are addressed. And those 3 components of identity awareness are, and it's important to acknowledge them again here in this space, understand one's identity as a staff member, assist students in their own personal identity awareness, and then understand community identity. And so at an earlier professional learning session this year, Dr. Parrott had a session around cultural identity, and she talked about this concept within the context of cultural responsiveness or cultural responsive practices in Virginia Beach, and we engaged in this activity. And so she had us to reflect on culture as it's reflected in these 6 areas presented in research that was shared by Gary Howard. And so we engaged in this activity with her. We reflected on what we might consider to be our race or ethnicity, our religion, our language, our life values, our career or vocation, and then our possessions. And she had us brainstorm around this and share with each other. So this is one activity that a group of staff might engage in to really explore their own cultural identities. But let's think about it. I mean, we've all been to a lot of trainings. We've all been involved in a lot of different activities, or maybe seen some online. So in the next discussion, let's share with each other. Do you know of any other activities that would be beneficial for staff to engage in as they explore their own identity? So let's just share some thoughts, and you can look up any, you can research any. It's up to you, but let's just share a little bit about any other activity we might think might be beneficial as staff explore their own identity. All right, let's move into voice, the next component. There are a few TFI features that align with voice. Okay, so we'll go through each one. The first is team composition 1.1, which we know has to do with the representation of stakeholders on those PBIS teams. But the cultural responsive elaboration shares that school PBIS teams not only include stakeholders as team members, but also actively elicit that ownership and voice and broad representation of our communities, our families, and especially those underserved families and cultures, right? And then although teams should be small enough to be efficient, family voice is critical. So they share, for example, that if team size is a concern when trying to integrate families, consider the use of subcommittee structures and have families represented on the subcommittee. So that's an interesting idea. We've talked about this quite a bit. Let's look into the second TFI feature, which is faculty involvement 1.10. This aligns with voice as well. They talk about, obviously our PBIS big idea here that we already know about is just that faculty voice being essential, right? Where we make sure that faculty are seeing data, that we're sharing it with them, right? But the elaboration shares that school staff are actively engaged in all PBIS Tier 1 practices. They demonstrate ownership of the system. They accept responsibility for sustaining the practices that are effective for everyone, right? We know this is our goal. We can't always achieve it sometimes, but just trying to build that ownership among staff, especially by sharing data consistently, is so crucial, right? And then this other TFI feature that aligns with voice is 111. Student, family, community involvement. We spend so much time on this, right? Engaging stakeholders. We know what it means, but what is the elaboration regarding cultural responsiveness? School teams and staff see student, family, and community partnerships as vital, specifically when talking about improving student outcomes. And the partnerships provide opportunities for all of their voices to be heard and have their histories and experiences represented in the school setting. Connections to the school are authentic and collaborative when teams seek student, family, and community voice. We have probably seen some examples of this across some of our schools, and it's critical that teams engage all of these stakeholders that are representative of the school demographics, and especially any underserved populations. Okay, so let's stop right here for this discussion question, and let's think about this particular family engagement activity that was organized at Northumberland Elementary School. I have it linked right below this video as well in Schoology, and it's also linked in the slides. This family engagement activity was actually shared on the VTSS site, so I'm just sharing it here. So read through this family engagement activity. It's pretty brief, easy to understand. Would your family growing up, would your family have enjoyed this activity at your elementary school? So let's just think about that and think about how they engaged in this activity at Northumberland. Next question we can reflect around in this particular discussion thread is, can you envision a creative way that a representative group of family members can be integrated into one of your PBIS teams?